being with us today on our expert speak session. And the moderator is Mr. Rishi Gupta, who is our visiting fellow from New Delhi, India. So thank you, Sinderpal ji, for agreeing to discuss on a very pertinent issues concerning to South Asia. I'm sure the discussion will help a better understanding of the South Asian cooperation. Also, for the last few years, AIDIA has been working towards contributing its 2 cents in making South Asian regional cooperation a reality. Therefore, such engagements with the experts like Rajaratnam as towards that. I hope that the discussion will be very interesting to our participants. And thank you so much again. And over to you, Rishi, to take the conversation forward. Thank you. And once again, I welcome everyone on today's Zoom meeting.
Thank you, Sunilji. So good afternoon and good evening to you all. On behalf of the Asian Institute of Diplomacy and International Affairs, Kathmandu, I welcome you all to another very exciting episode of Expert Talk with Dr. Sinderpal. The topic of the today's talk is regionalism in South Asia, SAARC and beyond. As we know, South Asia is one of the richest regions in terms of culture, civilization, economic potential, and human resources. With a large region, it is connecting with almost all parts of the world through land, sky, and maritime. It also comes with a large number of differences. For centuries, the South Asian region has proudly earned the title of unity in diversity, yet differences have often led to the disintegration of political unity. As the largest country of all in the South Asian region, India has been looked upon as an elder brother. But in recent years, it is the big brother that has dominated the political discourse. It is probably due to an aspiring India, which has resources, a strong economy, technology, and military might. Yet it fails to coordinate in conveying the goodwill. However, with the advent of globalization, the idea of regionalism in South Asia became a strong ladder for geographically smaller countries to cooperate with India for bilateral development prospects. The concept of cooperation also picked up within a short span of time with the establishing of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, in 1985. The annual summits of the SAARC were indeed looked as an opportunity to mitigate differences and make a new start. Every member state was given a role to host several bodies of SAARC to make it more inclusive and functional. Within 35 years of its inception, SAARC reflects more political stress than institution of South Asian integration. There are unresolved issues like border disputes between India and Pakistan, terrorism has become an industry, and trade between and among the SAARC countries has not seen any substantial progress. While India is blamed for dominating SAARC, some believe that bringing China will balance the current thaw. In 2005, China had entered the SAARC as an observer member with the support of Nepal and Pakistan, much to India's unhappiness. Just 18 summits in 35 years, with the last one held in 2014, and no further SAARC summits have taken place so far. Since then, despite the high hopes that emerged with the election of Prime Minister Modi in 2014 to revive it, it has not happened so. During the first tenure of Prime Minister Modi, BJP had promised to work towards a greater South Asia regional cooperation. In its manifesto also, PM Modi and BJP had made it the priority. Meanwhile, there was SAARC satellite, which later became South Asian satellite, which showed that there are differences of a greater kind. In the second tenure, Prime Minister Modi was seen, and the party BJP was seen making BIMSTEC as the vehicle for regional cooperation because it does not have Pakistan. While for India, it may help to avoid Pakistan strengthen ties with other South Asian countries. Countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, Afghanistan think otherwise. It might come down to India's failure to rise above differences and lack of leadership to lead the region. Clearly, India knows that cooperation in South Asia is a contested reality. In this light, is SAARC still a regional vehicle, or BIMSTEC has it all? Or there is something beyond it? To answer this, we have Dr. Sunderpal Singh. Dr. Singh is a senior fellow and coordinator of prestigious South Asia program at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. His research interests include international relations of South Asia with a special focus on India's foreign policy. Before joining Rajaratnam School, Dr. Sinderpal was a senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at National University of Singapore. He has published articles in various journals and periodicals such as Asia Policy, Asian Security, Pacific Affairs, India Review, and is the author of India in South Asia, Domestic Identity, Politics and Foreign Policy from Nehru to BJP, published by Routledge in 2013. He has also contributed book chapters on aspects of India's northeast, specifically in relation to India's ASEAN land connectivity, as well as Southeast Asian perceptions of India-China maritime rivalry. He received his PhD from University of Wales, his MA from Australian National University, and his BA from National University of Singapore. So without any further ado, I request Dr. Sunderpal Singh to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank my friend Sunil as well for his opening remarks. I want to thank AIDIA for inviting me to share my views on what I think is an important topic. South Asian regionalism doesn't get discussed so much nowadays. It's not as fashionable as it once used to be. And I also want to thank Rishi, who actually we met I think it was 10 years ago in Pondicherry actually. And so I want to thank Rishi also for his opening remarks, because he touched upon a few points that maybe I want to also elaborate on. I was given the topic South Asian regionalism, SAARC and beyond. I find that in forums like this, the less the speaker speaks, the better, because it allows more time for people to have a discussion, ask questions, and basically have a conversation. So in that spirit, I will try to keep my remarks brief, try to say some controversial things so we can have a interesting debate. And basically, and then hopefully we can then invite some questions and have a discussion. Okay, let me start. I think in any discussion on South Asian regionalism, what we sometimes forget, not forget, or sometimes we omit to mention is that in the academic or even the job in academic literature, be it international relations or geography, the term South Asia is actually a very recent invention, right? Of course, we use the term on hindsight as if it existed centuries ago, but the actual use of the term South Asia in the literature is a relatively recent phenomenon. In fact, after the end of the Second World War, as the post-colonial phase started, post-colonial elites in what today we call South Asia were starting to frame regionalism not in terms of what today we see as South Asia, but in broader Asian terms, right? So you had this phenomenon of the leaders of what then was Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, being part of what was called the Colombo powers, right? The 5 Colombo powers. The other 2 obviously were Indonesia and then Burma, now Myanmar. And these Colombo powers, 3 of them, India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, were given the task, they took upon themselves the task of trying to frame the aims and the objectives of that famous 1955 Afro-Asian conference in Bandung, Indonesia. And this notion of the Afro-Asian conference in Bandung was largely largely built on the notion that we needed something, we needed Asian fraternity, there needed to be Asian solidarity, which could push against perceived, Western imperialism in global affairs as the Second World War was winding down, as the Cold War was, gaining. The Cold War was, getting more hot in a sense. So you get this, you got this phenomenon where these countries were involved in trying to frame Asian solidarity around that period. And of course, I mean, most people who are listening know that India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the first few people of the biggest spokesman for kind of Asian solidarity, Asian fraternity. Now, the notion of this Asian fraternity was built on one important assumption, and the assumption was that India-China friendship would push back against this continued Western imperialism in global affairs, right? Countries have become independent. They didn't need the West anymore, and India and China, as two large Asian civilizations, were pushed back against Western imperialism. As we all know, these lofty hopes of Asian fraternity did not last very long. And I think they faltered largely to many reasons, but in my view, there were two key reasons. The first, of course, was the assumption that smaller Asian states will view Western powers as a bigger threat to their security as compared to larger, more proximate Asian neighbors. That was a huge assumption, which was proved to be wrong. Secondly, of course, as India-China relations deteriorated, and leading ultimately, of course, to the 1962 border clash, a major bedrock of Asian fraternity disappeared. So you come to a point where you had this idea of Asian fraternity, and the South Asian countries were, a major part of it. But as the India-China Hindi Chini Bye-Bye movement sort of dissolved, then this notion of Asian fraternity also starts to ebb away. For me, the next stage starts in about the 1960s, where now India began to ditch notions of Asian solidarity and started to look at the world not in terms of regional units or at least geographical notions of fraternity, but more in terms of who was aligned or non-aligned, right? So you get the beginnings of the non-aligned movement. India, of course, one of the major movers and shakers, helmed the organization of it, the formation, the development of it. So I think that's you saw the sort of next stage of how India viewed association of countries, no longer geographical, but in terms of, for want of a better word, the ideology of non-alignment. As part of this new approach, going past Asian solidarity, India also sought to keep both superpowers out of what it perceived to be its backyard, and that the geographical ambit of that backyard will approximate roughly to what today we see as South Asia, right? So two things going on at the same time. In a sense, they sort of reinforce each other. Now, one of the defining moments then is the civil war in the Pakistan, and then the establishment of Bangladesh as an independent state. And the independence of Bangladesh happens via the division of Pakistan. And all the end state of this gave the Indian state the impetus and the confidence then to say, we can keep outside powers out of South Asia, right? And so you carry on, there's a continuation. In fact, there is an establishment of this. In the literature, people started referring to this phenomenon as Indra's Monroe Doctrine. In fact, some scholars used to call it the Indra Doctrine, that only India, if there's a problem in South Asia, India will be the only one who can solve it. No other foreign powers should be allowed. And this, in a sense, carries on. Now, by the late 1970s, of course, there is a push by countries within South Asia, minus India, for greater regional cooperation within South Asia, within some kind of regional grouping, for example. India, however, remained cautious. The reason for this cautiousness was it feared that, led by Pakistan, the other South Asian countries will gang up on it and then restrict India's goals, India's actions within what it perceived to be its backyard, and also worried that the Cold War will come to impinge on Indian foreign policy via any kind of multilateral setting. However, I think the other South Asian countries, especially Bangladesh, I think in this case, and even Nepal actually, went a long way to try to assuage these Indian concerns. And these concerns were assuaged by restricting the goals of SAARC to what was seen to be non-sensitive areas, largely, culture, after a while, trade, and more importantly, to keeping bilateral disputes, issues outside the ambit of this association. So since its formation in about the middle of the 1980s, SAARC, on some level, has ambled along. But of course, I mean, it is common knowledge that the SAARC's progress, SAARC's growth as a regional organization has been held back largely by the nature of the India-Pakistan relationship, a relationship that's been marked by acrimony in large parts. And to the extent that even something as nominal as yearly SAARC summits, regular yearly SAARC summits, even that goal was not always achieved. Again, largely as a result of India-Pakistan acrimony. Now, the next stage, in my view, the next stage comes in about the 1990s as India then starts to embark on its Look-East policy. And a lot of analysts look at this period as India's attempt to break out of its region, to break the South Asian straitjacket. And during this period, India increasingly gets enmeshed in several ASEAN-led organizations. So we have the ARF, the ADMM+, the EAS, and around this time, you get the sense that India is trying to not only reconfigure its approach to regionalism, it's trying to reconfigure its region. What is India's region? And there is a kind of reconceptualization of India being part of the ASEAN plus East Asian multilateral process dialogue. This did not mean that SAARC was completely, or South Asia in the sense was completely ditched. SAARC remains useful as a venue to discuss trade, other kinds of connectivity with South Asian neighbors. But as Rishi earlier sort of hinted at, at the same time, India has adopted a policy of constructing forums and processes within South Asia on the minus Pakistan model. For example, basically meaning constructing dialogue, forums, processes that exclude Pakistan. One example, of course, is the BBIN, which is where you got Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. So trying to cooperate on issues related to resource management, cross-border connectivity, infrastructure development. To some extent, there have been important achievements by BBIN. They made some headway, but a lot of analysts still believe that much more that could have been done has not been done, and there still remains much more to be done. Now, you got the BBIN, then you have an expanded version of the minus Pakistan model, which is the BIMSTEC. Again, Rishi sort of touched on it. BIMSTEC, of course, has the five South Asian countries and 2 Southeast Asian countries, Myanmar and Thailand. And BIMSTEC's scope is quite interesting because it started off in a sense similar, not exactly similar to, not identical, but similar to BBIN. But its scope has increased. So it, it started to look at things like trade, connectivity, resource management, but increasingly there are some security issues being discussed, like counterterrorism, also intelligence sharing, And so I think BIMSTEC's sort of scope has widened. Again, similar to BBIN, while BIMSTEC has made some progress, and as Rishi said, Indian Prime Minister Modi, especially during the second term, has tried to make BIMSTEC a major part of India's kind of foreign policy, one of India's foreign policy goals. There is still a lot that could have been done, hasn't been done. The usual kind of analysis where a lot of analysts say you could have done this, haven't done enough. So we have a continuation of the South Asian regionalism, which excludes Pakistan. Now, we start the story from the kind of early Asian fraternity. We then move to the notion of the non-aligned movement and the different kinds of fraternity. Then talked about the formation of SAARC. Now moving to different kind of South Asian forums and how India also is in East Asian forums. Now, as we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, we look towards a post-COVID future. I think regional cooperation within South Asia has become slightly more complex, and not for the better. It's become more complex because what areas and issues on which countries could cooperate earlier, which were largely deemed to be non-traditional areas, firstly, they become important. But secondly, the difference or the gulf between what was seen as traditional security areas and non-traditional areas, the gulf has become smaller. It's the difference between the two has decreased. Why is this not a good thing? I just give you an example. The provision of medical supplies in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the provision of vaccines, for example. Now, in these domains, what some time ago would be seen as non-traditional domains, they become securitized, and they become securitized largely because of the deteriorating relationship between India and China. Right? So against the background of deteriorating relationship between India and China, the spaces which were not securitized have shrunk. And this difference between, as I said, the diminishing of the difference between traditional and non-traditional areas has meant that, has posed some challenges for South Asian regionalism. I just come to them in a bit. Before that, I think one more term needs to be introduced because it's definitely going to come up, probably going to come up in the Q&A. So I just got to put it out there. You cannot talk about regionalism in this region at this point without talking about the Indo-Pacific, of course, right? I mean, it's the left, right, center flavor of the month. Now, as India looks to push back against what it perceives to be growing Chinese influence and presence in the Indian Ocean region, you obviously see India's defense relationship with the United States growing substantially in the last, say, 7, 8, 9 years, right? Besides the growing relationship with the US in the context of the Indo-Pacific, or at least in the Indian Ocean region, India has also expressed a keen interest in playing the role of a security provider in the Straits of Malacca, given the location of India's Andaman Islands in relation to the Straits of Malacca. So on one hand, some analysts see South Asia is becoming less and less important in India's broader endeavor to construct a wider role for itself. I think, however, that analysis needs to be tempered, largely because I think the Bay of Bengal is where South Asia meets the Indian Ocean region. And there is where I think a lot of the India-China competition continues to play out. And as this competition intensifies, the implications of this for South Asian countries are not very good. And they're not very good largely because they decrease the space for what IR scholars call hedging. That means being friends with both at the same time, don't have to take sides, reaping the benefits of being friends with India and China. Largely because, as I mentioned before, the areas which could be win-win, that means not zero-sum, that means you didn't have to choose sides, non-traditional areas, provision of infrastructure, connectivity projects, energy resource management. These areas are becoming increasingly win-win and decreasingly win-win and increasingly zero-sum. Because these are the areas where India and China look to compete for influence, for presence. And this complicates the position of the other South Asian states when it comes to trying to build habits or processes of South Asian regionalism while maintaining their ability or their choice of action with other countries, in this case, China. Now, on that controversial note, I think I'll leave it there, and then maybe you can invite some questions and a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sinderpal. Thank you for an elaborative presentation. Let me conclude the points that Dr. Sinderpal made. He rightly discussed how South Asia term came in use very recently, and how 1955 Afro-Asian Conference built the notion that we needed a Asian solidarity that could push Western dominance in the international affairs, and how Nehru talked about Asian solidarity and fraternity. And it was possible with the cooperation of India and China. However, these lofty hopes, as he mentions, failed. India-China cooperation was dissolved with 1962. There was NAM, which also paved way for regional cooperation. The civil war in Pakistan and creation of Bangladesh was a defining moment in giving India confidence of its power beyond region. Also, how SAARC's progress has been held back by India-Pakistan. Amidst such downing hopes, there is BBIM, BIMSTEC to bridge that thought. You rightly mentioned, sir, that it is not just the trust deficit for the failure of regional cooperation, but there are increasing aspirations of India that go beyond South Asian region. Hence, the priorities have changed. With this, let me start with my own question, and then I'll open the floor for further questions. Three keys in my question is it the deeper pockets of geography? I hint at the accusation that India has a big brotherly attitude, but what is actually keeping South Asian countries away from India?
Oh, thank you. That's not an easy question. I guess if you look at a lot of the work on, say, small states, right? There's a whole literature on small states and how they behave. And I come from a very small state. I think small states, a lot of the literature looks at how small states create agency for themselves by making sure that they don't foreclose options, right? And one way not to foreclose options is to make sure that you're friends with the great powers, with all the great powers, and you're not on the wrong side of any great power. So you don't end up you don't have to choose sides, right? And I think with South Asian countries for a long time, and I think rightly so, they practice quite classic hedging behavior, where they did things with India, they also did things with China, and it suited their national interests, and it was fine. What I'm saying is that those areas are narrowing, because earlier the sensitive areas was, say, for example, buying arms, right? So that would be, you either buy from this person or that person, or or you sign a defense agreement with either one or two. But now in non-traditional areas, for example, just saying connectivity development, which country is going to build your 5G, for example, is no longer I can take all, right? You got to choose. And that choice is strategic now, because then you send a signal. And so I think that's how, in a sense, South Asian countries are now in a more difficult spot. And I guess India sees China's influence in South Asia as undermining its own interest. So again, I think that's the kind of dynamics that's pushing India and South Asian countries, pushing them away from trying to, forge more meaningful ways of trying to cooperate.
Thanks, sir. I think there is a question in the chat box asked by Dr. Sarita. And her question is, considering looming aspirations of every state in South Asia, is regionalism possible? Look at Bangladesh, it is doing better as an individual country than it did under SAARC, despite it was one to formulate the idea of SAARC.
Yeah, I think the question there, I think, is an assumption. The assumption is that people join regional bodies to get better. Here, I assume better means become economically stronger, richer. I don't think SAARC at any point had such lofty ideals. The idea was for at least conflict not to reach a certain threshold, and also to have certain lower levels of maybe some amount of trade cooperation, some amount of economic connectivity. And of course, the person who asked that question is right. Bangladesh has surged quite far ahead in terms of all the indices that we've seen in recent years. So yeah, and in fact, I think, just to lead on from that question, I think that development has actually helped in forging kind of what you unilateral cooperation within South Asia. So the idea is that you don't need all. You can have 3 countries doing something together, 4 countries doing something together in functional areas like hydroelectric provision, road connectivity, freight connectivity. So I think, in a sense, the Bangladesh situation actually helps in creating more opportunities in terms of the niche functional areas where unilateral cooperation in South Asia possibly can happen.
That's quite a good suggestion. We have a question on Facebook Live. The question is, you mentioned that BIMSTEC role has widened, but when India proposed a joint military exercise, Nepal backed off at the last moment, despite it agreed. We see even BIMSTEC falling apart. So can we say that India-Pakistan contention is the only contention that SAARC is falling, or others as well?
So yeah, I think that firstly, the Indian suggestion caught quite a few people by surprise, because this was an organization that was supposed to largely mirror BBIN, not do military exercises, and then of course Nepal in the end backed out. And I think on some level, the simple answer to that question, of course, no one can say that they have convincing evidence to say so, but one could say probably, again, Nepal wants to carry on hedging its bets, right? Wants to keep that space for itself where it can maneuver between what it sees as the 2 giants on 2 sides, India and China. And maybe in its estimation, in Nepal's estimation, doing a defense exercise with India was a step too far in the other direction. You send a wrong signal to China. So that's possibly the reason. Of course, Pakistan, in this case, Pakistan didn't play a role. But as I said in my last part of my presentation, the bigger factor affecting South Asian regionalism at the moment is the nature of India-China competition. There used to be a time when India-China competition could be segmented, right? And even the Indian state, and even I think Prime Minister Modi's government in the first term attempted to segment the competition, say, okay, in the military domain, even in the naval maritime domain, we will compete, and that's fine. But we can cooperate in other areas, right? Economic, etc. And the idea was that this cooperation will mitigate some of this cooperation will mitigate the competition in the military domain and will stop the countries from raising their competition above a certain threshold. I get the sense that the Indian government has decided that the competition is across the board. There is no segmentation anymore. It's all out. So in economic domain, in infrastructure development, everything is an arena of competition between India and China. And that's why I was saying that then decreases the space for South Asian countries to carry on hedging and getting benefits from both sides.
Sorry, I think they got disconnected. Okay, so we have Abu Salah Muhammad Yusuf, who is also a fellow at Bangladesh Institute of Strategic Studies. Dada, and he was also there in Pondicherry. So, Dada, would you like to intervene?
Thank you, Rishi, and good afternoon to all. I think I can make a question. What is I am thinking when you talk about the recent developments in South Asia, as well as India's role, we are talking about India-China relations. But my question to Dr. Singh, would you think in the context of recent developments, particularly if I talk about the developments in Myanmar and the developments in Afghanistan, do you think that India can make a better role or can engage small countries of South Asia to ensure the stability of the region? And would you think there is also one kind of situation has developed this way that India needs to be more active in this region to ensure the development, security and stability of the region? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good question. I think I don't think it will be, I mean, it's quite, for me, it's quite obvious that the Myanmar situation and the Afghanistan situation have been a net negative as far as India is concerned, right? Both these developments are not good for India. The saving grace for India on the Myanmar situation is very few countries have benefited from the Myanmar situation. There's no net winner necessarily outside the country in the Myanmar situation. So when it comes to Myanmar, of course, I think the ASEAN countries are also, to say that they are at a loss would be an understatement. How do you influence this regime to make sure that the killing that has been going on stops, or at least there's a reduction, that there's a semblance of stability? Because in Myanmar, I mean, India has a border with Myanmar. Increased levels of instability in Myanmar will probably, doesn't take a genius to figure this one out, will lead to movements of migrants, refugees across the border. So obviously India has a huge interest in making sure it's stable. But how much influence he has in Myanmar, I think it's a big question. Afghanistan, I mean, for India, the American withdrawal is a big setback. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. It's a huge setback. Of course, there's been a lot of discussion about whether India can reach out to the Taliban, found some kind of understanding. I'm not an expert on that subfield, but I don't think that is settled yet. Again, with Afghanistan, the instability that will come from if the situation carries on as it is, I think Pakistan, for example, will, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in Pakistan already about maybe we shouldn't be so glad that the Taliban is going to come to power, because there will be negative implications for Pakistan as well. So in the Myanmar, Afghanistan situation, I think India's choices are quite limited, but I think it's trying, especially with the Taliban, I think there is some sense that maybe India needs to think out of the box. If there's a chance to engage with the Taliban and build a more inclusive, or at least maybe inclusive is a high goal, at least a stable enough Afghanistan, then I think that would be how they will meander. But I think the next few months will be key to see whether that any kind of understanding happens with the Taliban.
Thank you, sir. We have another question on Facebook, and it is asked by Adrija. The question is, non-traditional actors in Myanmar army, it's a follow-up question. Non-traditional actors in Myanmar army and Taliban, we are trying to engage with them and opposite to what we advocated previously upfront, the democratic values. So are we falling China way?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of these cases, democracy is the ideal goal. I think the problem is that India, and I think rightfully realizes, and even the ASEAN countries when it comes to Myanmar, realize that you're not going to reach that goal in one go. You got to reach the stability goal first, right? And then build stability, and then build on that to get these countries more democratic. So I think with Afghanistan, yes, I mean, India has traditionally, said that we are not going to engage. The Taliban are not someone, but I think, sometimes the efficiency of a country's foreign policy is when you can make sudden changes to suit your national interest. And in this case, there is a lot of thinking going behind India's attempts to reach out to the Taliban. The key question here is, how much does the Taliban have to gain by engaging India? I think that's a big question. I'm not saying there's none. Some people have ventured to suggest that there are reasons the Taliban, if they want to come in, there'll be a different kind of unit from before. They want international legitimacy, etc., etc. So there might be some grounds, but I think the democracy thing cannot be put necessarily at the start, because I think you're dealing with two very complex situations where the stability of the state is already in question. So I think the first idea is to build something stable where people are not being killed on a daily basis, and then maybe move up to the next level where you try to build democratic institutions, democratic processes. We can't hear you, Rishi.
Sorry, I got muted. There is a question from Shilata. She asks, what is the next stage of South Asia regionalism? Would it improve or deteriorate in near future? I think everybody can see.
That's a kind of $1 million question. Hard to say. I mean, as I pointed out, I think at the moment, again, if you read, I've answered the question a slightly roundabout way. If you read the literature on small states and how small states maximize their security, someone had a very interesting hypothesis of a trend. Now, if there are more than, say you take the example of two great powers, right? So in this case, you got India, China, and South Asia, right? Now, you don't want them to get along too well as well, because then you cannot accrue benefits that come from their competition, right? Because so the threat cannot be collapsed. But you don't want them to have a relationship that's too acrimonious as well, because after a while, then you have to choose sides, right? So I think South Asian states, like most small states, where they have to deal with great powers, one somewhere in between, right? Healthy competition, but they still get along. And so I think if that is accurate, then the future doesn't look all that great, because at the moment the trajectory of Indo-China relations seems to be not moving in a positive direction, right? The situation seems to be deteriorating. And as I said, the competition seems to be across the board in every domain. And so that again shrinks the space for South Asian countries, and therefore, in some level, South Asian regionalism.
Are there any other questions? Please unmute yourself and ask. And if there is no question, just my last question will be, sir, as I mentioned in the analysis also, you mentioned a point, very important point, which is this is not just stress deficit. There is increasing aspiration. There are increasing aspirations of India, and that go beyond South Asia. We see Indo-Pacific happening, and in India, going not away, but somehow increasing its proximity. So, what will be the major bullets when we talk about India's increasing aspirations? What will be the major bullets that we can say, all right, this is where India is prioritizing its national security, maritime security, everything under the aspect of national security and foreign policy interests. What would be the major bullet points?
Thank Rishi. That's a good question, and I think you mentioned this earlier, and I somehow missed it. I think this notion of trust deficit sometimes it's a very lazy term that people use. I think when they cannot explain something, they say trust deficit, and in my opinion, just move slight tangentially a bit out. I think the India-China relationship is not a trust deficit problem. It is strategic competition. It's very clear that India's capabilities have increased, China's capabilities are also increasing, and so therefore there will come a point where they will have to compete for the same stuff. This is not a trust deficit. A trust deficit problem is one country doesn't want to increase their influence, but they do it because they think the other person is going to act in ways. This is not the issue. I mean, the whole security dilemma thing, this is not a security dilemma situation. It's a strategic competition situation as far as India and China is concerned. This is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because security competition can be managed. And to a large extent, I think, especially in Indian Prime Minister Modi's first term, I think the idea was to manage the security competition. Acknowledge that China is a strategic competitor, be ready to say no to China, be less afraid about getting China angry, but don't go out of your way to look for fights, right? So find areas where you can cooperate, etc. So that's the India-China kind of backdrop. Now, when it comes to what are India's main, say, bullet point, what do they want to do? I think the key issue here would be that especially in South Asia, I think India would see China's increasing military presence within South Asia, and here again, the Bay of Bengal is key, I think, as a highly negative development. And I mean, this is not something that is, I'm saying something that is groundbreaking. I mean, we all know the incident of the Chinese submarines in Sri Lanka, remember? And how India made sure that its views on that issue were very well known. So I think when it comes to security competition, as you mentioned, trust deficit, the India and the South Asian countries, again, I think everybody is like, it's like how individuals behave. Your role in society sometimes dictates what your interests are, not always, but sometimes. So small states will behave in ways where they can get maximum out of great power competition, while great powers will try to, in this sense, compete with each other. So India's relationship with, say, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bhutan, etc. I think that the key point is that with India and the South Asian countries, it's not necessarily a trust deficit issue. It is the way that the broader India-China competition is playing out. Also, one more thing that we hardly touched on is how the nature of domestic politics in each of these countries impacts India's relations with these South Asian countries as well. I mean, we all know how regime change in certain smaller South Asian countries impacts how well they get along with India, right? I mean, there's no secret. So again, I think I wouldn't see this as a trust deficit. I'll see this, there are some structural factors at play. Who knows, maybe after a certain time, India and China will come to some kind of great power understanding. And then from there will flow better chances for South Asian regionalism to happen. The key also, the other point here is that I think, I'm not putting any normative value on this, but I don't think China is ready to cede influence in South Asia to India. And I think for India, that to some extent is non-negotiable. And there again, you see things that the two cannot exist at the same time, side to side. So that's the strategy competition.
All right. I think there is a follow-up question to what you said right now. There is a question from Brian. He's a student at Jindal School of International Affairs. What exactly is India doing wrong that is enabling China to enter South Asia with such a heavy influence? We are told that neighbors are worried about the big brotherly influence, but then we have also seen how India does everything possible to prevent the development of such an image. This is given that China is actively behaving ever more aggressively. The takeover in Hambantota is representative of that. Why then are the neighbors still willing to do a tango with China?
It's a long question. Let me just try to answer it as briefly as I can. Maybe I think some of this, of course, as I said, is driven by domestic politics. As you've seen, in fact, I think there is enough to say that India-China competition, not only in South Asia, even in the larger Indian Ocean region, has some resemblance to the US-Soviet Union Cold War competition, where part of the competition involved helping to bring about governments or regimes which are friendlier to one country or the other. I'm not saying there is something untoward going on here, but you can see that pattern happening. So first thing is domestic, when we talk of countries, that why country A wants to tango with, to use your words, tango with Beijing, I think one needs to be careful, because that same country, when the government changes to democratic elections, they have different ideas about how to manage the India-China, the relationship with India and China. The second answer to your question is, these countries are in need of capacity development aid for also for building infrastructure, for building capacity. And if somebody gives it to them with little strings tied, apparently, then it makes sense to do it. Now, the bigger question is, there is some sense, at least there is some analysts think that a lot of the infrastructure projects done by China may not always bring a profit. So what are the incentives behind doing projects in South Asian countries that do not bring a profit? Now that's a larger question, but that comes back to your question about, if someone wants to give it to me and I need to build capacity in my country, then to some extent those countries will take what comes to them. So tango with Beijing, I guess again my third point would be, but they also tango with India, right? I mean, it's not that they say we don't want to have anything to do with India. Even Sri Lanka under the current regime is very careful about not necessarily pissing off the Indian government. That again shows that they're trying to walk a middle path. It's not an easy path, but the middle path. Don't piss off China too much. Don't piss off India too much. Do enough that both sides want you. And so I think, again, that would be how I characterize South Asian regionalism. My point today was how long and how much can South Asian states, smaller South Asian states, carry on doing this in light of the competition? I'm not very sure.
I think we have one more question, and that should be the last because we have already exceeded the time. There is a question from Sarat Gupta. Should SAARC as a concept needs to have a rethink on political issues, territorial disputes, before it takes the step on furthering regional cooperation? As an example, European integration was preceded by the normalization of France-Germany relations, and ASEAN process took the next step after Vietnam improving relations with its neighbors countries in Southeast Asia.
Oh, you asked me $1 million question again. I mean, I think you can reverse your question. You suggest that if territorial disputes are solved first, then you should build on that first and then work on cooperation. But if the only thing that lies in the way of cooperation is the territorial dispute, and to a large extent, that territorial dispute looks to be something that's intractable, because it doesn't seem you can reach some kind of mutually acceptable condition, right? So then you must ask yourself, does it mean that therefore regionalism is probably doomed to fail? It probably is, especially in the sense that if Pakistan needs to be part of any kind of regional process. The European example, don't forget, the Europeans had to unite as the Cold War happened. There was the Soviet Union. There was an impetus to say, hey guys, let's just forget our problems. We got an existential threat, right? That communism was spread through Western Europe. And then there's an ideological battle. The Americans were willing to support through the Marshall Plan, etc., etc. So I think in that sense, it's very apples and oranges, are very, very different. ASEAN also, yes, ASEAN, Vietnam, true, but the India-Pakistan situation is not a Cold War problem, right? The Vietnam-ASEAN thing was a Cold War relic. The Cold War ended. There's nothing else left. So Vietnam becomes part of ASEAN. But then the India-Pakistan issue is not a Cold War issue. It goes to, the founding roots of the states, or both states. So how do you solve a problem that, as they say, is existential, right? It relates to the reason for why people think those states exist. And that is one of the most difficult issues normally to resolve.
I think we have more questions and less time. So I guess we should have another session.
Okay, sure.
So on behalf of the Asian Institute of Development, Diplomacy and International Affairs, Nepal, I would take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Sinderpal, for being here and sharing your thoughts. Indeed, it was an engaging session, and we had people on Facebook watching us live on YouTube, and we had a good Q&A here. So let's hope to have another session very soon. And thank you again, once again. Thank you, sir. So we close this session.
Thank you.